Okay, so the last video we looked at the firebombing of Japan, which started in March 9, March 10 of 1945. And today we're going to be looking at the last significant battle of World War II, which was the Battle for Okinawa, one of the most significant battles in world history, really. So here's our Pacific theater map, and we've been following the Americans as they progress across the Pacific into Japanese territory. Seems like quite a while ago we were talking about Guadalcanal and Tarawa, Saipan, more recently Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, the Battle of Manila, then Iwo Jima, and now you see both the Army, which was coming on a more westerly path, and the Marines, which were coming from over here. They met together on Okinawa in April 1, Easter Sunday, 1945. All right, so here's a battle map of Okinawa. So it's an island located south of mainland Japan, as you saw from the previous map. And this was part of Japan. There were 300,000 to 400,000 civilians, Okinawans, that lived on Okinawa. But this had been annexed by the Japanese, I think, in the 1800s. And we wanted this island, which was about 60 miles long, because of its great ports and airfields, and we wanted to use this as our forward operating base for an invasion of Japan. Iwo Jima, much too small, not close enough. Okinawa, we were going to take Okinawa, and then we were going to use it to, kind of like we used England before D-Day. We were going to just stockpile Okinawa full of supplies and men to launch a massive invasion of mainland Japan. And so that's the purpose. That's why we're going after Okinawa, so we had this base from which to invade Japan. This would be an 82-day battle, arguably the most terrible fighting of the entire war. Maybe you could argue the Germans and the Russians in the winter was worse for different reasons, but you got torrential rain, so the terrain turned to mud, and just the horrible fighting, right? The Japanese took the lessons they learned fighting the Americans at Saipan and Peleliu and Iwo Jima, and they didn't oppose our landing at all. We were able to land on Okinawa without any opposition. And what the Japanese did is they found the most defensible places on the island, and that's where they invested all of their defenses, their artillery, their mortars, their machine guns, all tucked away in only the most defensible positions. And the Japanese had about 100,000 plus men here. So at Iwo Jima, they had like just over 20,000. So 5 times the number of troops. Now, some of these, maybe 20,000 or so, were Okinawan conscripts, basically people from Okinawa that were forced to help the Japanese. The leader of the American forces was U.S. Army General Simon Buckner Jr. So it was both the Army and the Marines. He was in charge, and he basically attacked the Japanese head on. And he would die days before the end of the battle. He was hit by Japanese artillery. Interesting thing about General Buckner was that he was the son of Civil War General Simon Buckner Sr. And Simon Buckner Sr. Surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Fort Donelson in the early part of the Civil War. So interesting that, the Civil War seems like so much earlier in American history than World War II, but here we have the son of a Civil War general leading the most important American battle. Okay, so this is from the final campaign. It's just talking about some of these defenses. Sugar Loaf Hill, Horseshoe Hill, this defensive complex, the Shuri line, they call it. It says, so sophisticated were the mutually supporting defenses, we've talked about that before, of the three hills that an attack on one hill would prove futile unless the others were simultaneously invested or attacked. Mortars, anti-tank guns were all in perfect positions to destroy American soldiers and Marines. And it says, on all approaches to this group of hills, this defensive complex, were within the zone of the heavy artillery the Japanese had on Shuri Ridge, which dominated the entire battlefield. So the 7th Marines, which lost 700 men taking Takeshi, lost 500 more in the first 5 days of fighting for the Wana complex. In that short period in May, they lost 12 officers because there's really nowhere that the Japanese couldn't hit with their artillery. So the officers would come to, forward operating places, observation posts, and then the Japanese would hit them with artillery. The other regiments suffered proportionally through the period of the 11th to the 30th of May. They would lose 200 Marines for every 100 yards advanced. That is astounding. This is from With the Old Breed, just again talking about kind of this defensive situation on the heights of Shuri and Takeshi, and then Wana Ridge. So you got Wana Ridge and Wana Draw, and the Japanese were heavily entrenched back in caves, kind of like Iwo Jima, caves and tunnels. And the Japanese took advantage of every difficult feature of the terrain. It couldn't have provided a better opportunity for their defense if they had designed it. The longest and bloodiest ordeal, the Battle for Okinawa, faced the 1st Marine Division. So here's a close-up map of this defensive complex. You have Naha City, Shuri Castle, which was the historic seat of government on Okinawa. And then you've got these like Sugar Loaf Hill, Half Moon, Horseshoe, Wana Ridge, Takeshi, Chocolate Drop, this area here, where the heaviest Japanese defenses were. And then just talks about, this is again from EB Sledge and the Old Breed, where he just talks about how they would give them periodic rests to help them deal with the strain of the battle. And then how hard it was to go back into battle after you had a few days of reprieve. He says, with each step toward the distant rattle and rumble of the hellish region where fear and horror torture us like a cat tormenting a mouse, I experienced greater and greater dread. And it wasn't just dread of death or pain, because most men felt somehow they wouldn't be killed. But each time we went up, I felt the sickening dread of fear itself and the revulsion at the ghastly scenes of pain and suffering among comrades that a survivor must witness. Some of my close friends told me they felt the same way. And another part of the book, he talks about watching litter carriers, going over open field and getting shot at, and how difficult it was to watch people get hit, not being able to help. It says the bravest wearied of the suffering and waste, even though they showed little fear for their personal safety. They simply had seen too much horror. So like Sledge was at Peleliu. So a lot of these guys who are fighting at Okinawa had been other places fighting the Japanese. He says the dread of going back into action obsessed me, became the subject of my most torturous and persistent of all the ghastly war nightmares that have haunted me for many, many years. So PTSD here. The dream was always the same, going back up to the lines during the bloody, muddy month of May on Okinawa. It remains blurred and vague, but occasionally still comes, even after the nightmares about the shock and violence of Peleliu have faded, been lifted from me like a curse. Maybe no fighting in American history was worse than the month of May on Okinawa. I think maybe the Chosin Reservoir, but again, different reasons. More mental health issues arose from the Battle of Okinawa than any other battle in the Pacific during World War II. The artillery, the mortars, high casualty rates led to a lot of combat fatigue. Rains caused mud that prevented the tanks from going through. Couldn't get the dead out, so a lot of them were just covered with a thin layer of mud, which they had to fight through. So you read that from EB Sledge again about how they would end up digging foxholes where dead people were, Japanese, maggots, dead bodies, falling into mud, getting covered with maggots, covering dead bodies loosely. It says thousands of bodies, both friend and foe, littering the entire island, create a scent you could nearly taste. Morale was dangerously low by the month of May. So they had been ready fighting for a month, right? They started April 1. Ruthless atrocities of the Japanese had made Americans want vengeance. And then the Japanese used Okinawan people as human shields. So they would run them out ahead of a Japanese attack or something so that the Americans would try to avoid hitting the Okinawans, and then the Japanese would have an advantage. So that this is well documented, what the Japanese did to the Okinawan people, who they saw as less than, like not real Japanese. Over here, over 26,000 casualties were caused by battle fatigue, which is basically like a precursor to PTSD. He says, I've seen guys, this guy, Bill Pierce from the Marine Corps, he says, I've seen guys sitting there sobbing. Others refuse to go. You're sleeping in a hole every night, and anything you do could get you killed. So it's just exhaustion, like 100 nights with no sleep. Okay. So this is Julian Dusenberry. So when the Americans took Shuri Castle, this heavily fortified area that we've just been talking about, how difficult it was to fight through, the only flag they had with them, so thinking back to the spirit of the Iwo Jima flag raising, the only flag they had close with them was this small Confederate flag that was in the helmet of Julian Dusenbury. Now, we don't know if he was the one who actually raised a flag here on Shuri Castle, the Confederate flag. Some say he did. Someone said it was just his flag. But regardless, a Confederate flag was the first flag to go up on Shuri Castle. Soon it was replaced by an American flag. But it's just kind of interesting. So just in the news, I saw yesterday that the current Marine Commandant, so that's the highest officer in the Marine Corps, General David Berger, just outlawed Confederate symbols in Marine bases. So here we are 75 years after the Battle of Okinawa, and where you had a son of a Confederate general as your head officer on Okinawa, and the first flag on Shuri Castle was the Confederate flag, and lots of Southerners fought. Disproportionately more Southerners fought than Northerners. And this guy was from South Carolina, and supposedly we know it was his flag, just don't know if he was the one who actually put it up. But anyway, he won a Navy Cross, which remember is an award just under the Medal of Honor, for his heroics fighting in this area on Okinawa. And some people say he would have won the Medal of Honor had it not been for this Confederate flag, which caused kind of a stir. This is Shuri Castle. So obviously it was rebuilt after the war. So you see this beautifully ornate, ancient architecture. No, I just read in the news too that this burned down or partially burned down last year. So I don't know what state it is in currently. Another American hero, James Day. So you see here on Sugar Loaf Hill, one of these terrible part of terrible fights as part of the Okinawa battle. Talks about how he led his squad, and then he gets stuck in this kind of foxhole, and it's got a machine gun that eventually would be destroyed by the Japanese, and how he fought attack after attack, helping the wounded. And then it says over 70 dead were counted around his position. Then on a third day, he repulsed another attack, and they think he killed up to 100 different Japanese. Just incredibly heroic. And so for that, he won the Medal of Honor. Now, he would go on to fight in Korea. I think he won. He won 3 more. He was awarded 3 more citations, 3 Silver Stars in Korea, and then in Vietnam, and a Legion of Merit. And then after that, so he fought World War II, Korea, and then Vietnam. And then after that, he dedicated part of his life to finding artifacts that were stolen from Okinawa by Americans. And then he had returned over 100 artifacts back to the Okinawan people. So, and he got an award for that too. So quite the American. And maybe the most famous Medal of Honor winner for us now is Desmond Doss. So he was a man who didn't want to kill anybody, but still wanted to do his part. So he joined the military, was mocked and criticized going through training because he didn't want to shoot anybody. But his heroics here, you can read about how during the Battle of Okinawa, he repeatedly, on many different occasions, saved men's lives as a medic and carried them to safety over long distances again and again. And his constant prayer, he said on his lips, was, "Lord, please help me get one more." And so he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery saving men. Now, some people say he saved 50 guys. Some say he saved 100, somewhere in between. But it's clear he saved a lot of men heroically. Until he was hit. He was wounded, I believe, with shrapnel, and then he was hit again and broke his arm. And then he was getting carried back, and he saw someone else who was wounded worse than him, and so he told the litter bearers, "Go get that guy instead." And he had to tend to his own fractured arm and then crawl back 300 yards to the aid station. So what a hero. So just look a little more about what happened at Okinawa. This woman, Masako Nakazato, was part of these group of nurses that was formed by the Japanese. And so you see there in the city of Naha, which is not very far from the worst fighting, 220 women and girls were part of this died. Many more were recruited. And she just talks about how the Japanese encouraged mass suicide, just like at Saipan, where they claimed the American soldiers were going to brutalize them. And so she said, "Many of my friends believed the Japanese soldiers and went to kill themselves. I was saved at the last second, and I'm here today. Every day I regret it that I'm alive, while they," meaning her friends, "are not." One particular incident, she recounts, of Japanese soldiers ordered her and other civilians hiding in caves to walk out into a hail of bullets. They wanted to know where the snipers were positioned, so they used civilians as human shields. We were innocent schoolgirls, and they made us walk into enemy fire so they could save themselves, she says. How will I ever forgive them? So here we are. We have our own problems, right? But if you're, high school girl, just think about what it would be like to be forced to be a nurse in this gruesome battle, and then to be used as a human shield, and to be told your Americans are going to brutalize you, and so they encourage mass suicide, and or almost all your friends were killed. Just terrible. So then this other quote here: "Goaded in self-annihilation, many Okinawans chose to leap to their deaths from cliffs. Others resorted to using razor blades, kitchen knives, strings, rat poison, stones, and rocks to kill themselves and their children. So very similar to the Gyokasai at Saipan. On this picture on the far left bottom, you see two Marines with the Okinawan orphan that they're protecting in a foxhole. I thought that picture was particularly moving. Now, after the end of the battle, they put up this massive memorial called the Cornerstone of Peace Memorial on Okinawa, where every name of every person, Japanese, Okinawan, Korean, there was Koreans here that were forced here by the Japanese, Americans, civilians, plus armed forces, every name of every person they know of who died on Okinawa is written on these walls. So you see the top left picture, how an aerial view, just how big this complex is, because there's got to be over 200,000 names. So we have the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Maybe you've seen that. You can Google pictures if you want, if you have not, which is a wall of all 50-some thousand Americans who died in Vietnam. But this is 4 times as many names, or maybe 5 times. This picture on the bottom left is Mary. She was one of the children of General Buckner. So as I said, he was killed towards the end of the Battle of Okinawa. And so she's pointing to his name, Buckner Simon Jr., Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. So she went to go see her dad's name on the wall, obviously years after the war. But definitely a place I would like to go. And just looking at the Navy part of the Battle of Okinawa, just a moment. So here's the famous picture of the invasion materials being offloaded, and then all these hundreds of ships in the background. This is the largest invasion in world history, right? Hundreds and hundreds of ships, thousands and thousands of men. We had probably 250,000 men in the Battle of Okinawa. So, yeah, an amazing amphibious assault of this Japanese-held island. So one of the big problems we ran into was kamikazes. The Japanese were desperate to protect their homeland. And so almost 2,500 kamikazes. Remember, kamikaze means divine wind, after what they called the storms that blew the Mongols from taking over Japan way back in the 1200s. So these special attack unit pilots who survived the air and surface screens inflicted grievous damage on the 5th Fleet. By the end of the campaign, the fleet had suffered 34 ships and craft sunk, 368 damage, more than 9,000 casualties, the greatest losses ever sustained by the U.S. Navy in a single battle. The Japanese also used this new weapon they called the Ohka, which means cherry blossom bomb. The Americans called it baka, so it's kind of play on words there, right? Japanese called it Ohka, we called it baka, which means foolish. It was a manned solid fuel rocket packed with 4,400 pounds of explosives. So they drop it off of a Betty bomber, like it shows in the picture up here. It could go over 400 miles. It was just basically a super fast, huge bomb that was manned by a suicide pilot. And they, of course, considered it a great honor. And these inflicted huge damage, but a lot of them moved too fast for these inexperienced pilots to handle. But another weapon. This picture on the bottom left is American anti-aircraft shooting at night against Japanese night attacks. You can see the tracers. That's what this is. So just the picture exposure effect of all these tracers zooming across the sky as anti-aircraft from all different places, anti-aircraft fire trying to shoot down the Japanese. Pretty amazing picture. So here's one example of the Japanese kamikazes. So the USS Bunker Hill aircraft carrier was hit by 2 kamikazes within 30 seconds, killing 370 men. So it says the U.S. Navy would suffer 4,900 dead and 4,800 wounded in the Battle of Okinawa, which is really amazing considering the Japanese Navy was basically decimated. The Japanese Air Force was basically gone. And so almost all of these men were wounded because of kamikaze attacks and acts of desperation by the Japanese. If you remember the Battle of Leyte Gulf, we talked about the biggest battleship ever built, super battleship, the IJN Yamato, which remember was its turrets, which weighed 3,000 tons. These huge 18-inch guns, biggest guns ever on a battleship in world history. How the Yamato led the center fleet against the Americans at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And here it is making its last stand. The Japanese decide in the heat of the Battle of Okinawa that they're just going to send the Yamato in. They think it's just going to shoot up the American fleet and ram ships and cause all kinds of damage. In reality, we had submarines that picked it up, alerted the U.S. Navy when it was 200 miles out. And the Japanese aboard the ship knew they were going to die. They were basically told, this is a suicide mission. Go kill as many Americans, die in glory. And so anyway, so the ship goes to Okinawa. It had some destroyers to protect it from subs, but didn't have anything to really protect it from planes. So we sent about 400 planes at it and dropped, hit it with 12 bombs and 7 torpedoes. So the picture here is of a bomb splash. But then this picture here is this massive explosion on the Yamato. You see this is another ship right here, right? So this, you see the towering explosion that happened. So what we think happened is one of our bombs hit the ship's magazine and just blew it in half. And so there's almost 3,000 Japanese on the ship, and 2,747 would die. One survivor said he remembers almost getting sucked down near the propeller, because the propeller, or screw they called them, on the ship was just, massive. And he said the only thing that kept him going was he had just seen his newborn son. And so he told his son, obviously later, he said, the only reason I'm alive is because I was thinking of you when I was almost drowning. So the Yamato was sunk. And this picture down here is just, as this plaque says, it's a huge armor plate, because the Yamato had this massive armor, because it was twice as wide as the American battleships, because it didn't have to go through the Panama Canal. So our battleships were, like half as wide. So this ship was twice as wide, and in part because it had these massive guns. And so in order to shoot them without the ship capsizing, it had this massive armor, especially on the waterline, to protect it from torpedoes and such. And so we took a big hunk of armor that was similar to what the Yamato had, and we blasted it with a 16-inch shell from one of our battleships just to see if it could go through. And it did at point blank range, but hard to say if we would have been able to take the ship down with our surface ships. But obviously planes were the wave of the future as aircraft carriers in naval warfare. Thought I would close out by looking at some other Okinawans and their memories of this battle. So Masayoshi Oshiro, who's going through some, when this was written, some mental things, he says, he's slowly losing his mind. He says, over the years, I've forgotten the faces of friends, family, and even where I live sometimes. So maybe suffering from dementia. But the war, that's different. I remember the war as if it happened a few hours ago. And this is a common thing with veterans, right? They think about it. We've seen this in the documentaries. They close their eyes and it's like they're right back in the war again. The smells, the sounds, the fear, the emotions, it all comes rushing back. Do you know what is worse than dying in a war? It is surviving it, because every other day after that, you think about it. This is amazing, right? This is from Kiku Nakayama. who at this time was in her late 80s. So and she was a very young girl, 16 kind of, or 18 when the Battle of Okinawa happened. So just every day, well into her 80s, she remembers things about the war that she went through. Shortly after turning 18, she was moved to a cave near Naha City, near the worst of the fighting. Surgeries were almost always done without anesthesia and were all performed at night because the sound of the U.S. airplanes above outmasked the screams of the Japanese she was forced to work on. On her sixth day on the job, she was assigned to assist in a surgery on a rusty metal table that was secured to the ground using rocks. My job was to hold down the shoulders of injured Japanese soldiers, when their limbs were being amputated by the doctors. I used to get a lot of scolding from the head doctor because I couldn't bear looking at them suffer, and I would look away. She's an 18-year-old girl, forced into doing this with hardly any training. In June, there were rumors that an airstrike was looming, so they had to evacuate the caves. They successfully evacuated about 80 injured soldiers. There was only one soldier left. He had lost his left leg to a mine. He was screaming in pain. Kiku was one of the last few to leave the caves, and he asked if she would be coming back to get him. I said yes, even though I knew this was the last time I would ever see him, she said. I think about him all the time. So hopefully you learned something about the Battle of Okinawa. Hopefully you empathize with these people, what it was like for the people of Okinawa to have this massive battle happen. 100,000 Okinawans die from mass suicide, from being caught in the crossfire from the Japanese, killing them. And just these people, decades and decades later, they still remember, right? They still remember.